Good morning, everyone. My name is Frances Anderson, and here with me today is Jeffrey Schiffer. We are the co-chairs of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee. The committee secretary has confirmed that we have quorum, so I'll call meeting number 6 of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee to order and welcome everyone. The meeting is being held using the city's WebEx technology, with members and staff connecting by video conference or telephone or attending in person at City Hall. While under normal circumstances, we would not be able to hold a virtual meeting of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee. City Council amended the simplified rules of procedure for advisory boards to allow us to meet by electronic means during and for some time following the declared COVID-19 emergency. Once the emergency is over, and we pray it'll be soon, we will return to holding our meetings in person, in accordance with the advice from Dr. Eileen de Villa, the City of Toronto's Medical Health Officer. Because we are meeting remotely, we ask for your patience with any delays or technical issues. Members of the public can observe the meeting on YouTube at youtube.com/Toronto Council Live. There are 6 registered public speakers for this meeting. Registered speakers are connected to the meeting by audio. The full list of speakers can be viewed online by visiting the committee's webpage at toronto.ca/council and clicking the speakers box for today's meeting. I'd like to remind all staff and presenters to keep their mics muted with their video turned off unless they need to address the committee. This will make it easier for Jeffrey and I and those watching along on YouTube to observe members as they participate in the debate and vote on each item. Members, please keep your mic muted unless you wish to question staff or speak to an item, and ensure that your video is turned on. As part of each agenda item, we will ask members to raise their hand or unmute their mic if they wish to question or speak. We will then create a speakers list and will call on members when it is their turn to speak. When voting on an item or a motion, I ask that members ensure that they turn on their video and raise their hand to indicate their vote. Members, I want to remind you that although you are participating remotely, you must still submit your motions in writing to the committee secretary. The clerk's staff are available by email at ecdc@toronto.ca to help with motions. To start off the meeting in the proper traditional way, we will now have the offering of medicines by Selena Young, Director of the Indigenous Affairs Office, followed by an opening blessing by Larry Frost of the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto. Larry, please.
Can you hear me? Francis, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Celine, for that smudge, and that brings us all to a positive mind and thinking. I asked the Creator today to thank you for bringing us all together. I ask the Creator to guide us in a positive way, that we continue to do the good work we do for our communities, our families, the people who are homeless. We ask you to continue our good collaboration through good partnerships and to keep us unified. And we ask that you give us good health. And we ask this COVID-19. Oh, Creator, please let it go away. With that, I say miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you, Selena, and thank you, Larry. Although we are in different locations and meeting remotely today, the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee acknowledges the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and now is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we're grateful for the opportunity to walk on Mother Earth in this place. Are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? If you have an interest, please raise your hand or unmute your mic to let me know. Hearing and seeing none, may I have a motion to confirm the minutes from our last committee meeting on July the 7th, 2020? Do I see a motion somewhere, somehow? Councillor Layton. Second, Larry Frost. All members, if you can raise your hand. Anyone not on video or connected by, can you unmute? All in favor? Ayes. Any opposed? The motion carries. We'll now proceed to consider 6 items on the agenda. The first item is item AA 6.1, Indigenous Affairs Office update. We'll ask Selena Young, the Director of Indigenous Affairs Office, to provide an update for the committee. Selena?
Marcy Francis. Greetings, everyone. It's really wonderful to be able to see you all again. Thank you for the opportunity to share a few pieces of work that we have underway in the Indigenous Affairs Office. So preparations are being made to form an Indigenous placemaking advisory circle comprised of Indigenous designers, knowledge keepers, land stewards, and others who will ultimately guide and advise on the city's Indigenous placemaking efforts. An interim circle will be established initially to co-develop any terms of reference or governance and assist with engaging community to identify people who have the expertise and knowledge to serve on the circle. The expectation is that this interim circle will be established in late September, and we'll be back to this committee to share more information and get your feedback. Also related to placemaking, we've been doing some work with INEGB as well as Aboriginal Legal Services to ensure they have access to land to deliver critical programming and ceremonies for communities. So for INEGB, that's along the Humber River, and for Aboriginal Legal Services, that's on some land just outside of the city's archives building. The Indigenous Affairs Office will be working with Fire Services on a report to Council. We're not quite certain of timing, but we're pushing for November of this year. And the aim there is to seek to remove permit fees for ceremonial fires, for sacred fires. This is the first step in decolonizing the rules, if you will, around sacred fires. The requirement for a permit is actually under the provincial fire code, so we're going to work with the province and community to try and exempt sacred fires from requiring that permit. Longer term, the office will work with the Placemaking Circle, Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, Fire Services, and other city divisions to develop a more holistic approach with respect to sacred fires. So the conversation that we're having later on the agenda today is very timely. We are supporting police reforms work that's being led by our colleagues in social development, finance, and administration. There are a lot of pieces to this work. If you remember the motions that were put forward back in June at the council meeting then. There's 3 areas that are likely the most relevant here, and those are the alternative public safety response models, an accountability circle, and selection criteria for the next chief of police. We've only just started doing this work, so we're going to be engaging community, starting with Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, and return to the Aboriginal Affairs Committee with a more fulsome presentation in October. We're also working with the Toronto Indigenous Community Advisory Board, Indigenous housing providers, and city colleagues in shelter support and housing, and the Housing Secretariat on Indigenous housing. I'd really like us to be able to bring some information to the committee on that in the near future, ideally the October meeting. Just a few more things that I'll share with you. While the City of Toronto has commitments to Aboriginal peoples, as well as made a commitment to UNDRIP, the city doesn't yet have an overarching action plan or strategy to advance truth and reconciliation and decolonization. So we're working on a draft informed by some great feedback that we got recently from some Indigenous partners that we are working to incorporate meaningfully. We recognize that we have an opportunity to be bolder and to push for change, so that is our intention and objective. There's more work to do engaging community members and organizations, and the strategy or action plan would of course also come to this committee, possibly multiple times to ensure we incorporate your expertise as well. And I think the last update I have is related to education. So as you may be aware, educating the Toronto Public Service on colonization, Indigenous history, and culture is a priority. Over a year ago now, a one-day foundational course named Indigenous Cultural Competency Training, or ICCT, was launched following a request for services for an Indigenous trainer to deliver that course. The first full year of the course went really well, and it started out well in 2020. Unfortunately, as I'm sure you're aware, due to the pandemic, all in-person classroom training has been canceled for the remainder of the calendar year. So we've shifted and are working on what is possible virtually for now so that some level of training can continue to be offered. And in the interim, and to keep Toronto Public Service staff progressing in their learning, our colleagues from the Learning TO team have developed some short modules, e-modules, focused on encouraging individuals to reflect on their understandings of privilege, systemic justice, and settler colonialism. While these modules are short and introductory...
This is Catherine?
We're happy...
Hi, this is James calling from the City Clerk's office. Have you signed into the meeting yet? We noticed you weren't logged in yet.
It's okay. No problem. So I was just mentioning the e-modules, privilege, systemic justice, and settler colonialism. Short, introductory, but happy that we've got them and adding into the overall learning landscape to serve as foundations for that more comprehensive course. And I think I'll leave it there. Merci, thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back to the co-chairs.
Thank you, Ms. Young. As you can see, we had a little glitch, but that doesn't stop us. Members, do you have any questions of staff or need clarification on an item? If so, please raise your hand or unmute your mic to let me know. I see Angus from Wigwamen. Go ahead, Angus.
Thank you for that report. It was most interesting. It has been at least half a year, I believe, since the Leadership Advisory Circle of the Indigenous Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship met. It's been at least half a year since there's been any kind of an update. I dare say that construction must be progressing well, and I'm wondering if, I don't imagine that it'll be the case for this meeting, but I wonder if we could have a full report on the Indigenous Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the next Aboriginal Affairs Committee, along with some, including some information about how the LAC will be re-engaged.
Thanks very much, Angus. That's great. I'm happy to have the agenda item in October at the next meeting for the Indigenous Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And between now and then, I suspect the Leadership Advisory Circle will be getting an update, but regardless of that, we definitely can ensure it's on the agenda. So thank you for suggesting.
Any other questions? Are there any speakers to the item? If you wish to speak, raise your hand or unmute your mic to let me know. Hearing and seeing none, do I have a motion to receive the item? Angus Palmer. Second, Larry Frost. All those in favor, raise your hands. Any opposed, raise your hands. The motion carries. Sorry, anyone on the phone, if you unmic? Thank you, the motion carries. I'm turning the mic over to my co-chair, Jeffrey Schiffer. Please.
Thank you, Francis. Okay, good morning, everyone. This brings us to agenda item AA 6.2, Indigenous Community Safety and Mental Health Responses in Toronto. You'll note that this item was deferred from our previous meeting on July 7th, 2020. And I just want to start with providing a really brief overview on this item. We've just heard from Selena that there's a variety of work being done through the Aboriginal Affairs Office in collaboration with SDFA and others, looking at potential Indigenous-led community responses to mental health. And we wanted to, ensure that we had an opportunity to discuss this, as a committee. I think that a number of us are engaged across the city right now as agencies, having conversations with community and other organizations, thinking about how potential resources could be flowed to Indigenous responses grounded in culture to support community members struggling with mental health, whether this is wellness checks or other responses. And so I wanted to just put this item back on the floor because we had deferred it to ask if any members of the committee would like to discuss it or have points that they would like to raise. I will just say that, before we get here, we did defer this item because I think there was a recognition that there's a lot of separate conversations happening across the city. We, as co-chairs, had a discussion about this before the committee, just really recognizing that Toronto's a large city, the Indigenous community is large, there's different needs in different neighborhoods. We anticipate that we are going to see the development of a variety of different pilots and initiatives in this space over the coming years. And one thing that we were curious about as co-chairs is the role of the Aboriginal Affairs Committee in, supporting a larger structure around what this emerging service framework could look like. I think we're interested in hearing from members of the committee around, efforts or initiatives that their organizations have been involved in, and hearing about thoughts and perspectives around what the role of this committee should be in ensuring that, these types of programs develop in a good way moving forward. So with that, I will just open the floor and ask if there are any members of the committee that would like to make comments on this item for today. Okay. Oh, you could. Do we have, so if we have a registered speaker, I believe we may have a registered speaker from the public on this item. I just want to ask if we do have a speaker present with us today. Okay. If we do have a speaker to this item on the phone, please do let us know. We do have a registered speaker for this item, Ms. Catherine Gandy. Ms. Gandy, if you are on the phone, could you please unmute your line and indicate to us whether or not you'd like to speak to this item?
Hello?
Hi, Ms. Gandy, I can hear you.
Hello?
Hi. Yes, I'll just remind you that you will have 5 minutes to speak to this item as a member of the public. And we do require members to speak on topic. So the topic being related to mental health response, Indigenous mental health response in the City of Toronto. Welcome.
Hi, good morning, council members. I am a member of the Native community. I am a long-standing member for all of my life. So I submitted a letter in regards to AA 6.2, Indigenous Community Safety and Mental Health Responses in Toronto. I wrote a 2-page letter which can be available for viewing to the public on the Aboriginal Affairs Committee City of Toronto website. So a lot of this larger discussion that is being spoken about, I feel as though that the community as a whole has been left out of a lot of the discussions that the Aboriginal Affairs Committee has been conducting since, I believe, 2016. It's really essential that the community is consulted, not just for this item number, but also for all of the developments through the pandemic that we're going through. And this was a need that was seen to be neglected before the pandemic as well. And so I felt compelled to be engaged with the committee because I feel as though that there's some things that really need to be highlighted. With respect to, and this goes with this item number and as well as with the Sacred Fire item number, proper title holders such as myself need to be consulted when it comes to land use and also with Sacred Fire ceremonial, and that it's not a necessarily role just for the committee in conjunction with the setup that happened with the Indigenous Affairs Office and then with the Executive Committee of City of Toronto. There has to be a discussion with proper title holders, and when it comes to mental health responses, I feel as though that Native Child and Family Services of Toronto is just not at the point yet to be able to be speaking to that aspect, because there's a lot that our community has faced in terms of trauma from their children being taken from them from the agency, and there is a significant amount of our community that strays away from accessing programs and services from Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. So I just wrote what I wrote, and I feel that task and as well as Indigenous Affairs Office can work together to have the town hall meeting online so that all of the voices can be accounted and heard and seen, and that all of the solutions that the community can come up with for addressing crises and also child welfare situation of well-being can be done in the community context and can no longer follow the ministry type of way of dealing with the child welfare situation, because now we have more children in the foster removal system than in the height of attendance in residential school. And so how are we going to get to a place where we're healing and we're able to benefit and utilize the land in the way that Native Child has put forward in the motion? It just doesn't make any sense to me. Any questions that anyone has from looking at my letter?
Thank you, Ms. Gandy, for your remarks this morning. I would just like to turn things over to members of the committee to ask if there are any questions to our speaker today. Okay, I'm just going to, I think we have a comment from our co-chair, Frances Sanderson. Frances?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. I appreciate the letter that's come in, and certainly we're going to take it into consideration, particularly the part about consultations within the community. This is the way we make things better for everyone. And thank you very much for submitting your letter.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Gandy and Frances. Seeing no further speakers on this item, I think we're going to move on, or can we have I think we need a motion to accept the item.
Pardon?
I'll move it.
Sorry, I'm just being prompted by clerks. My apologies. I just want to make sure before we move on that no members of the committee would like to speak on this item. I think I see Councillor Layton raising his hand.
Yeah, I'll just speak very briefly and thank the co-chairs for bringing this item forward. We've had some conversations leading to this moment, also leading to the vote of council, about how will the Indigenous community be consulted and how will these new services reflect diverse needs within the wider community, but also the Indigenous community in the city of Toronto. I think it's incredibly important that we establish right from the outset that the expectation is that we will get adequate resources to address community safety from an Indigenous perspective, because I don't think that those voices were as loud as they could have been at council. And I fear that we won't, at the end of the day, establish that an adequate level of resourcing is required in order to provide an alternate to traditional policing for the Indigenous community, specifically in the city within the city of Toronto, because there are unique needs. And while I think it's a little too early to tell what organization might be championing that. I think to the concerns of the speaker, what's brought forward, the proposal that's brought forward, while it is coming from one of the co-chairs who happens to be the ED of Native Child and Family Services, it's certainly, this is about looking for dedicated resources to ensure that that we don't forget the commitments that is required to address community safety amongst the Indigenous community, as we're having a wider conversation about community safety in the city. And I fear at the stage that we're at on the bureaucratic side of discussions around what would be appropriate, that we want to make sure just that we establish very early that the expectation of the recommendations coming to council will be dedicated funding to Indigenous-led organizations serving the Indigenous community to ensure for the safety of those individuals. And so I'm happy to see it forward and come through, and happy to, however I can, get it past the whatever next stages are necessary.
Thank you, Councillor Layton. I think that we are going to need further discussion on this item for sure. You know, I'll say that we have been working with the Indigenous Affairs Office and Anishinaabe Health Toronto and others to start community consultations. We've been chatting with people in Scarborough and elsewhere in the city to get a sense of what they would like to see emerging in their community around Indigenous-led mental health response. There's also been some tables convened bringing Indigenous folks together with Black folks in the city to support each other and talk about what the respective needs are in both of those communities. And I'm thinking that we are going to need to bring this item back and continue to have conversations about this at the Aboriginal Affairs Committee. So Francis and I did work with clerks to prepare a motion suggesting that we defer this item again for further discussion. I just want to make sure there's no more speakers on this item before I put that motion up. Are there any more speakers on this item? Just looking at the screen to see if I can see any waving hands or enthusiastic committee members. No? Okay. Okay. Jonathan, we can put that motion up whenever you're ready. Very simple motion, just that consideration of the item be deferred until the next meeting of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee, just understanding that we're going to need to continue to have report backs on this item as the conversation evolves. Would a member of the committee be comfortable in moving this motion? I think I saw Tracy, seconded by Larry. Miigwech. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn things over to Francis.
The next item on the agenda is item AA 6.3, which is Toronto's Year of Public Art 2021. Well, due to, Angus, did you want to jump in before we move on? Carry on.
I did. I thought that there was a motion and it was moved and seconded, and I wondered if we were supposed to have a vote on the motion. I missed that, sorry. Yeah, apologies, Angus, good catch. Okay, so we did have it moved by Tracy and seconded by Larry. All those in favor? By show of hands. Okay, any opposed? The motion is moved in good process. Thank you, Angus.
Now we can move on to item AA 6.3, which is Toronto's Year of Public Art 2021. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, we must defer this item to our October meeting. And if there are any speakers to this item, we invite you to attend our next meeting in October to respond to Toronto's Year of Public Art in 2021. So know that we are deferring this till October, and then we'll all talk art. Moving on. Oh, we do have a motion. Everything needs a motion. Our motion is that consideration of this item, AA 6.3, be deferred until the next meeting of the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee. I need someone to make the motion. Angus, thank you. Second, Ruth, waving her hand madly. Hi, Ruth. All in favor? Raise your hands. Opposed? Abstentions? We carried. Thank you very much. We're moving on to item AA 6.4, Dundas Street renaming. We're going to begin with the staff presentation on this item. We'll then hear from registered speakers before moving it back to the committee. I understand that Cheryl Blackman is the Director of Museums and Heritage Services, Economic Development and Culture, and Wayne Reeves, Chief Curator, Collections and Curatorial, Economic Development and Culture, will provide a presentation to the committee. Take it away.
So, good morning to the co-chairs and to the committee. My name is Cheryl Blackman. I'm the Director of Museums and Heritage Services, and thank you for having us at the meeting this morning. I'm joined by my colleague, Wayne Reeves, who should be now on camera. And Wayne, if you'd just like to introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, everyone. My name is Wayne Reeves. I'm Chief Curator of Toronto Museums. I also oversee the City of Toronto's ceremonial naming program for streets, and working with the city manager and many colleagues across the city organization, I'm project manager for the Dundas Street renaming project.
So we would just like to provide a little bit of background, and we also are hoping that you're able to see a screen that's being shared with the agenda of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to provide a brief background, and then Wayne is going to review a briefing note that's been prepared, and then we're hoping to have some discussion and then talk about next steps. So by way of background, around the world, discussions on racial injustice, inequality, and anti-Black racism have been brought to the forefront due to the killing of George Floyd and the situations that are arriving with the response from Black Lives Matter and the movement of citizens in the streets to really kind of speak to that dissatisfaction with the way that things have been moving forward. And so these renewed conversations are leading to an online petition that was calling for the Dundas Street to be renamed. And the petition objects to the street's namesake, to Henry Dundas, who was accused of being instrumental in delaying the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. In response to the petition, Mayor Tory asked City Manager Chris Murray to form a working group of staff, including the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit and the Indigenous Affairs Office, to examine the issue and to come back with feedback. So based upon that, this morning we would like to present you with the thinking of the group to date, and to basically frame the content of the briefing note that's been developed so far, and to speak to you about the next steps. And so with that, I'll turn it to Wayne Reeves to speak about the briefing note.
Thank you, Cheryl. So all the documents that have been prepared so far have been made available on a new City of Toronto webpage, including the briefing note that was sent by Chris Murray, the city manager, to Mayor Tory in the middle of July. As I mentioned, we have colleagues, over 40 city staff representing many city divisions working on this issue. Transportation services, parks, forestry, and recreation. We have the involvement of TTC, Toronto Community Housing, as well as the IAO, the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, and the Equity and Diversity Division. We've been looking at the issue globally in terms of assessing how other communities around the globe have engaged with anti-Black racism in the landscape, anti-Indigenous racism embedded in the landscape, through the legacy of monuments and street, park, and building names. Our approach, in effect, is not about erasing history, but it's looking at how history has been commemorated through the way that we've honored figures from the past. Henry Dundas is a very controversial figure, significant member of the UK Parliament in the late 18th and early 19th century, a very powerful cabinet minister, and a shaper of policy in terms of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. His connections to Canada come through the Lieutenant Governor, the first governor of the brand new province of Upper Canada in the early 1790s, John Graves Simcoe. Simcoe reported to Henry Dundas and as a result, named one of his two main military roads in the province after Dundas. The other street, of course, is Yonge Street. So we've been able to establish the linkages between Dundas and Simcoe, between the UK and Ontario. And with the petition proposing to rename the street, we marshaled a staff working group to look at the petition that now has over 14,000 names on it. And we reached some conclusions that we would report back to Executive Committee in September with 4 options for responding to the petition. And these are do nothing, which is not recommended by staff, to retain the legal street name, Dundas Street, with additional interpretation and recognitions along its course, to thirdly, retain the legal street name, but rename a number of civic assets with Dundas in their names, the city parks, a public library branch, Young Dundas Square. The fourth option is to rename both Dundas Street and all city assets. So not only the parks, the library, the major public square, but also the TTC assets, 2 subway stations and a streetcar and bus line that carry the Dundas name. We've been working to identify what the costs would be to the city corporation, as well as the impacts on the public, the residents, and the businesses currently located along Dundas Street. For the renaming option, we've begin to rough out a community engagement process that would hopefully be complete by the first quarter of 2021. And if indeed there's an appetite to rename all the city assets, to engage on a process that would have that process completed and new names recommended to City Council by the end of 2021. We've also realized that it's not just an issue of Dundas Street alone in the City of Toronto, that there are many place names and city assets that also systematically embed racism and discrimination. And we're going to be bringing forward some processes to address those broader framework issues beginning by the start of 2021, and then rolling out that evaluation process of all city asset names over the course of next year. And so, again, there's a real commitment on the part of staff to take action on this very important matter. Some people view this purely as symbolism, but with such a major arterial road as Dundas Street, engaging in a very thorough and thoughtful process with the community, that we believe that this, in fact, is a major step forward in addressing how racism is systematically embedded in the city's urban landscape. So I'd like to certainly turn it over to the members of the committee for discussion at this point. And again, to reemphasize that the Indigenous Affairs Office has been a part of this process since the beginning. And we realize that in looking at this issue through a BIPOC lens, that Toronto's Indigenous communities are as greatly affected by racism and discrimination in terms of how place names are embedded in the landscape as much as Toronto's Black communities are. So thank you again, and I'll turn it back to the committee chairs to open up the discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Blackman and Mr. Reeves. Now, if we have a speaker, I think we have a registered speaker. Are you there? And then we'll bring it back to the committee for questions of staff and speakers. We have one registered speaker. Please go ahead.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation.
Start the clock, two clerks.
I think that it is very important to, as I was saying previously, to have community consultation with all the Indigenous community, and considering the fact that this is treaty land territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, I would suggest that they be included in ongoing discussions. And I would like to see, as an Anishinaabe woman, that the name be Ojibwe. I think it's very important to have that discussion and also to bridge the two communities of the Indigenous and the Black community. And that would be healing, because unfortunately I can see, and many others can see, that there is room for discussions. And I think through the renaming of the street, it would promote healing of the two communities that have a shared history, and as well it can provide a catalyst so that we all can heal in the various forms of structural racism, lateral violence that occurs not only in the Indigenous community, but with the Black community as well. And here in Toronto, we do have a lot of children, youth, adults that are of mixed ancestry of Black and Indigenous. And so with that being said, I just want to put it forward that the Mississaugas, the New Credit, the Indigenous and Black communities can work together, as well as with the two speakers, the Executive Committee, Aboriginal Affairs Office, or the Indigenous Affairs Office, and as well as task to have that larger discussion at some point. Chimigach.
Thank you for your remarks. I'm sure that the renaming committee will certainly be entering into consultations with everyone, and will be including the Mississaugas of the Credit for sure.
Can I say something? This is Millie Knapp.
Millie Knapp, go ahead.
Hi, Catherine. I would like to acknowledge you and let you know that I hear you. And I think this is the second time that you've asked for a community consultation, and I really appreciate that, because I do believe that we need to hear from the community, and that we as organizations serve you as the community. And so I would just like to hear more of your voice, Catherine, and I'd like to ask you, how do you see community consultations taking place regarding all of the issues that you're bringing up? I'd love to hear your ideas. Chimigwech.
Thank you, Millie, for your input and for your support. I just feel as though, as a community member, that it's essential to civic. Hello? Hello?
We're listening.
We can hear you.
Okay. I just think it's important for the Indigenous community Native, Inuit, and Métis to be actively supported in being a part of civic life. And as I wrote to the city clerk, I indicated that I would like to speak, and also that it's really unfortunate that within the Indigenous community, that participation of Indigenous community members is not really seen in civic life, such as the meeting that is transpiring now. And for reconciliation to be fruitful and to be meaningful, it's so essential that community members are consulted. And for me, what's really dear to my heart is child welfare. I have been impacted by policies and legislation for several generations. My grandparents are residential school survivors. My parents are survivors, thrivers of the foster removal system, and as well as two of my children are survivor thrivers of the Millennium Scoop. And so it's with that I myself did not go into the foster removal system, and I just feel as though that there's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of confusion in the Indigenous community that when a community member is vocal, then what happens as a result of that is that that individual or small group of people that are calling for transparency and accountability of agencies are subjected to lateral violence in a very extreme form, which is tied into systemic institutional violence and racism. And so with that being said, I just appreciate the time that I'm able to speak, and so that all of the agencies that are a part of TASK and a part of the council can really hear the sentiments that has been present within our community for some time now. And now is the time, through the list of demands of Black Lives Matter, when it comes to defunding that institution, the Toronto Police, which has had a significant ongoing violent behavior towards our community members, that a larger discussion happen as to how is it that the outcomes can be culturally appropriate, and so that the solutions are discussed and done in a truly democratic way, where every community member has a voice, and that when the solutions are put in place, that there will be no room for racism, there will be no lateral violence, there will be healing, and the families to be reunited, because within our community there is forcible separation. There's loss of language, there's denial of language and culture and nationhood. And so when one is downtown and sees Dundas Street, what are the thoughts that come to the mind of Indigenous and Black peoples? Do they see themselves as being welcome on the lands in which their ancestors have walked? It's uncomfortable discussion at times, because there's so many discussions that have been needed to be spoken to. And I feel as though with the top-down approach of some of the agencies, that it's just made it so that structurally the Indigenous people's voices haven't been counted and heard. And the only way to do that is for immediate mechanisms put in place by TASK and the Indigenous Affairs Office to create and support for Indigenous community members to provide their input, their concerns, their suggestions, and their solutions.
Thank you. Are there any other questions to be raised?
I was hoping that Catherine might want to share her phone number with me so that I and Ampava could be helpful towards empowering her and strengthening her voice. I would like to work with Catherine and support her in the issues that she's raising. So I'd appreciate it, Catherine, if you'd want to share your phone number with me.
Millie, I would suggest that you and Catherine connect offline and not on at this time.
Okay, for sure.
Are there any other questions for the speaker at this time? Hearing none, I thank the speaker for participating, and I'm asking the members, do you have any questions of staff, of our presenters, regarding the Dundas Street issue? Ruth? You're on, Ruth.
Okay. Yeah, I know. You always have to wait a few seconds after the beeps. Hello. First off, thank you so much for this work. I'm very actually happy and excited to see this coming through. As this, and I know it will materialize because this is what's happening across our cities and our globes. And so thank you so much. And I'm really happy that Black Lives Matter has really forced this and had these conversations. I'm wondering, is there any conversation about other problematic street names throughout the city that this can inspire some change and some reflection on how we've labeled places? You know, I'm thinking of Indian Crescent and, you know, many other spaces across this city. Will this inspire some different conversations?
So good morning, and thank you so much for your positive comments. Absolutely, I think inspire is the absolute right word for what's going to happen here and what's been happening. We certainly, as a committee, are thinking holistically. We're looking at the Dundas Street renaming issue, but we also understand that, you know, there are many other streets that have problematic names. So we are looking at street names, we are looking at honorifics, we are looking at awards, we are looking quite broadly at parks. We're looking across the city at the connected naming concerns, and we're trying to think about the ways that we can advance a conversation and create a broader dialogue. I'll flip to Wayne Reeves to add any comments on that as well.
Thank you for the patience. Just to dive into the specifics, our initial scan has been of place names associated with slaveholders in Upper Canada, and particularly the town of York, as reflected in the current City of Toronto landscape. So we realized that other streets such as Jarvis Street, Russell Hill Drive, the Bobby Point community writ large are other places that are problematic. We've also heard from the community as part of this process just over the past month or so that other monuments such as to Sir Winston Churchill, to Sun Yat-sen, have also been called into question. So we'll be working through a very thoughtful process on how we broadly and holistically address literally thousands of place names. In Toronto, there's over 6,000 named streets. There's 1,500 named parks. And so there will have to be a sound and rigorous process to systematically go through that long inventory list of Toronto place names.
And if I could just add one final point, the earlier speaker, I believe her name was Catherine, who spoke about the importance of consultation. We really want to amplify that. That is our position as well, that it's very important to us that we have community input and consultation, and that will be part of the way that we see this work advancing as we begin to talk about and unpack this very challenging subject.
Quick follow-up, will universities be included in that? Names of universities? Awesome.
So thank you, Ruth. We're actually in conversations with a number of academics and scholars, and many of them are actually already initiating their own process to look at their names, Ryerson University being among them. So we found that there's an active conversation already in place with university communities, and we'll certainly engage with them in support of those conversations. And we've asked for key scholars, to engage with us to also advance our thinking.
I have a question here. This is Tanya Sank. This is for Cheryl and also Wayne. Have there been any initial conversations with school boards?
So good morning, Tanya. At this point, we have not yet consulted with school boards, but we are certainly still in the process of consultation. So you can expect that we will try to leave really nothing untouched in terms of reaching out and being broad in our perspective. We're talking to scholars right now that are in Canada, in the US, and the UK. So we really do intend to have a broad reach. So there will be a conversation there as well.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for the staff? Is there anyone who wants to speak to the item? Raise your hand or unmute your mic. Hearing no further speakers, do I have a motion to receive the item? Ruth, thank you. Second, Tanya. All those in favor, raise your hands. Are there any opposed? The motion carries. The next item, I'm handing item AA 6.5 to my co-chair, Jeffrey Schiffer.
Okay, thank you, Francis. That brings us to item AA 6.5, Data for Equity Strategy. We're going to begin with a staff presentation on this item. We will then hear from the registered public speaker before moving it back to committee. I understand that Donald Corbiere, Indigenous Affairs Consultant from the Indigenous Affairs Office, and Narina Nagra from the Equity and Diversity Consultant, People in Equity, will provide a presentation to the committee. Welcome to you both.
Ani wache, minogijep everyone. Donald Dishnikaz, Wikwankun Donjaba. Happy to be here and happy to be working for the Indigenous Affairs Office. Thank you everyone, co-chairs, for having us today. And so we're going to be talking about the Data for Equity project that we want to bring to you for support and sponsorship today. So we're going to start off with my colleague, Narina, and if you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll finish off the presentation.
Thank you all for having us and looking forward for this presentation. So as Jeffrey mentioned, I'm a consultant in the Equity and Diversity Unit in the People and Equity Division. And the purpose of our presentation today is to present to you the Data for Equity strategy and specifically to discuss and get your feedback on the idea of creating a circle of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis leaders, and also to support the divisional engagement, partnerships, and collection and use of First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and Two-Spirit data. Next slide. So why do we need a data for equity strategy? The city acknowledges that inequities exist and that not all Torontonians and service users have the same access to health, well-being, inclusion, and participation. This includes some groups of people who face discrimination and barriers resulting in worse outcomes. In May 2018, City Council directed city staff to develop an aggregated data strategy to understand who is accessing city programs, who is achieving which outcomes, and who is encountering service barriers. And we wanted this to be done in a consistent manner across city divisions. So this strategy is needed to enable us to advance the city's equity priorities by measuring and being accountable to Indigenous, Black, and equity-seeking groups, to provide a framework for the consistent collection and use of comparable sociodemographic data sets, and to make evidence-based decisions that are informed by equity considerations and the communities that are most impacted. Next slide. So what will the Data for Equity strategy do? The purpose of the strategy is to facilitate city divisions' ability to access, use, collect, analyze, and act on equity-related data and provide guidelines on the best way to do this. The focus of this strategy and the work is public-facing, so we're interested in sociodemographic characteristics of residents, program participants, and service users. The Data for Equity strategy focuses on collecting and using data that can be broken down by two specific areas of sociodemographics: who people are and how they identify. So that can include if you're First Nations, Inuit, Métis, if you're racialized, your various gender identities, if you have a disability, etc. But also where people live, so in which neighborhoods of the city, as well as what are your housing circumstances. How we've developed the strategy is recognizing that we need some guiding principles to ensure things are done in a responsive and responsible way. So these guiding principles include equity, inclusion, and human rights, privacy and security, open data, Indigenous data governance, and Black communities and data governance. Donald will be providing an overview of the Indigenous data governance principles later on. Next slide. So the strategy was developed through extensive research, review, and consultation. The staff report on the strategy will be going to the Economic and Community Development Committee on October 14th and proposes a phased approach to implementation because sociodemographic data collection and data use is complex, requires substantial time and resources, and is challenging to implement successfully and sustain. So we have proposed a phase 1 implementation plan that runs from June 2021 to December 2022 and includes the following key activities: establishing a Data for Equity unit to lead the strategy implementation, supporting the use of a set of guidelines that will be released with a report in October, and it outlines a data collection planning framework, a standardized set of sociodemographic questions and response categories, along with various recommended approaches and procedures for the successful implementation. There will also be some identified pilot projects that we will the unit will be working with to test the guidelines and evaluate their outcomes. There's going to be a community oversight perspective to ensure the strategy is accountable, transparent, as well as responsive by diverse community needs. There'll also be further development of the Indigenous data governance and Black communities and data governance principles, along with frameworks that will be needed for the successful implementation. And we'll also develop corporate-wide resources to support the collection and use of data, along with ensuring that the privacy, information, and technology activities are further embedded and implemented in the strategy. Next slide. This slide outlines the key equity-related sociodemographic data points that we would like to see all programs at the city collecting and using where appropriate. All of these data points have important equity implications. We know that these factors impact people's experiences and access of services, that they are measurable, important, and relevant to many of the service areas of the city, and can be acted upon to address barriers and inequitable outcomes. There are also an additional 7 optional data points that are not listed on the slide, and they include ethnicity, religion, housing, education, employment, family and household composition, and home language. Donald will now present the Indigenous identity questions and provide an overview of the Indigenous specific components of the strategy. Next slide.
Awesome. Chimigwech, Narina, for that. So this is the question that we're really asking divisions to use that are connecting with Indigenous persons. It really aligns with other work going on, including the Provincial Anti-Racism Directorate that Narina had mentioned earlier. In the question itself, we are still trying to use terms that some communities still identify with. For me, myself personally, I have always called myself an Indian my whole life, and I have this little card that still says Certificate of Indian Status. So this may not always be the case. And this is why these questions always need to be really constantly reviewed and advised upon by community. Also, we do include Canada in the question itself. And perhaps someday we may use Turtle Island. But again, depending on what we use, we may get a number of people identifying as Indigenous from somewhere else. And so this is why we've made sure to still keep Canada into the question. Recognizing again also that nations and communities are coming together. The second part of the question does have a check all that apply. So for example, my friend Janine from Northern Alberta could identify as from Métis settlement, but also she's also Cree. And again, it may be also further down into the race question that persons of mixed race can really truly identify with what makes sense for who they are. It may be also in the future that community advises us to really drill down further into territory regions, member affiliations, and treaty groups for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis persons. This has already been done here in the city by some Indigenous researchers. I have also heard from people like Suzanne from the Métis Nation around this table that she would like to have a better sense of where her community members are. And so I think that doing this work and maybe in the future drilling down further would really help support the work of everyone around this table. Also, we are proposing that the Two-Spirit question comes right after the yes to Indigenous question. We feel that this is kind of important because being Two-Spirit is kind of often more strongly tied to a person being Indigenous to Turtle Island. But again, still further down, a person can really identify in the gender and sexual orientation questions. Again, like we really need community's insight and to really kind of think and advise on this process and the way that it's going to be done. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So again, this is what we heard loud and clear in our early conversations, again, with community leaders, researchers, and again, some of the people around this table. There really needs to be continual and constant engagement and guidance from community. The approach and questions should not remain static, and really depending on the work may need to be adjusted, but of course, making sure that they still remain comparable across city divisions. So again, how do we ensure that Indigenous staff, program and service recipients, and the residents are really driving this work forward? This work needs to be presented so that there's always a strength and resilience lens approach to the work. And really we need to caution around describing community as vulnerable or at risk. Again, with this type of work, there's also a danger of having data shared that hasn't really fully been understood or really critically analyzed by First Nations and Métis people. So this is why we need Indigenous persons to really kind of support this. For example, when the LINs existed some time ago, their numbers were major undercounts in some of the regions. And I guess this had a direct relationship and a tie to funding. So I think that really we need community oversight of all of this. There are a number of organizations and leaders in this work, such as the Canadian Institute of Health Research and the graduate program at University of Victoria Indigenous Governance. And they really highlight the significant need for community-led partnerships, working agreements, to do this work. And really when connecting on Indigenous data, all of this is so important. They have also established protocols, guidelines, and really specific statements on what community participation looks like and what these negotiated agreements can look like. Again, how do we negotiate and really set upon creative partnerships and collaborations with city teams, divisions, organizations, Indigenous researchers? Again, how is this all being directed by and for community? Often our city processes do not really make for good connections to community. We often parachute in, do some engagement, harvest what we need for a report, and then move on. So Indigenous identity and Two-Spirit data really needs to have community oversight, and there always needs to be like a touch point. Next slide, please, Jonathan. At the end of this year, January 31st, I believe it was, our friend Lindsay and the team over at Task really worked with a couple divisions here in the city of Toronto, and they organized a day for us at North York. So we had divisions like SSHA, Social Development Finance Administration, Toronto Public Health, and even our office. We're able to really spend the day with Indigenous community leaders and community members. We opened in ceremony, we shared food together, and we're really able to present and work on and connect on some really large projects the city was working on. It was really nice to see persons like our friend Marianne Bedard from SSHA and Barbara Powell from SDF&A really connecting one-on-one for direction and support and understanding from community leaders like Darren Wilson from Native Child or Tanner from Wigwaman. So this type of circle really supports, I feel like, the time and efficiency that can happen here around this table at the Aboriginal Affairs Committee. Also, it really kind of, if we think about a circle like this where we're connecting city divisions and city staff with community and community leaders, it really builds the capacity of not only city staff in terms of their understanding of Indigenous communities, but it also builds the capacity within our Indigenous communities and Indigenous organizations to really understand and connect on what the work that we do here at the city. Next slide, please. All of this to say that we would again like the support of the Aboriginal Affairs Committee to build a circle of leaders and community persons to really move this work forward. I might suggest we start with a smaller group, maybe Caitlin, Shadrach, Steve, Brian, and Tracy. And if I could ask maybe each of you to really pull in a person you would feel could be a really good advocate for the community to support this type of work. We would also, again, like to connect and pull in persons, Indigenous researchers to really help guide this work, and have indeed connected with a couple already. But we know that some of you have also connected with Indigenous researchers, so we would also look for you to support and guidance around that. So Chimigwech, everyone, for listening today, and we hope to get your sponsorship and support for this work to go move forward. Miigwech.
Thank you, Mr. Corbiere and Ms. Nagra. We're now going to hear from the registered public speaker, and then we're going to bring things back to the committee for questions from staff of the speakers. We do have one registered speaker. Ms. Catherine Gandy, if you were still with us, you do have 5 minutes to speak on this item, and I'd welcome you to do so now.
Hi, I just want to say Chimigwech for the wonderful presentation. I just think a lot of commitment and forethought is shining through the presentation, and it's really heartening to see all of the different recommendations and what actually needs to take place to carry things forward, and the inclusion of community members, leaders, researchers, and staff amongst yourself and at the city level in general. It's just really good to see, and it's what has been needed for a long time. So again, I just want to say Chimigwech to both of you for your presentation and your viewpoints of how you see that we're able to move forward as a community and all of the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gandy. Members, do you have any questions for our public speaker today? For the public speaker? Angus?
This is Andrew. Donald, and you won't go for that. I wonder if I think when you're looking at, I'm going back to the page for identifying yourself within any of those. It's really important to know who the Haudenosaunee is. It includes a Mohawk, Onondaga. So we're not separate. So if you're going to say Haudenosaunee, make sure that you're putting us all together. Okay, so that's one comment. And I too want to acknowledge the work that's been done, and looking forward to more involvement on this.
Andrea, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt. It's just a matter of procedure. Before we move on to questions of staff, we just need to make sure that, I just want to know if anyone has questions for the speaker, just as a matter of, just to honor Ms. Gandy. Does anyone have questions for our speaker, or are we okay to move on for staff? Okay, seeing none, sincere apologies, Andrea. I'd like we'll continue now with questions to staff. Sorry, Andrea, please proceed.
Just thank you for that. I'm just repeating the same thing I just said. When we're doing identifications, who we are attached to our nations, it's really important to know that the Ongohowe or the Haudenosaunee makes up the Six Nations. So rather than Haudenosaunee and Mohawk are the same. So maybe what you could do, Donald, is to identify who they are so there's no confusion. Yamako.
Thank you, Andrea. Angus, I believe I saw your hand.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, super. Yeah, thank you for the presentation and for the good work. And I have a comment which is similar to Andrea's, and I just throw it out there as a caution. The process of collecting data is an important one, right? But I think it's really, really important to avoid double counting. And so while I respect and appreciate why you've broken out the two-spirited from the gender identity or from the sexual orientation question, I think there's a risk there that you'll get double counting. And in the same vein, I think there's a risk where you say, please select all that apply for whether you're First Nations, Inuit, Métis, et cetera. I think there's a risk that you'll get double counting. And so I just throw that out there as something to consider, because I think that double counting is something that really, really ought to be avoided. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus.
Yeah.
Donald, I don't know if you want to respond to that before we move on.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Angus. And actually, when we were talking to Janet Smiley, she did say that the way that the question is structured, that the first part of the question, so yes, no, prefer not to answer, that's hopefully that will be where most of the numbers will be captured. And then because I think our numbers right now are generally pretty small, and so to be further drilling down into the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Again, that's future things that we really want to do, because I think that's being asked for by the community. But I think for the purposes right now, that it's really making sure that first part of the question is mutually exclusive of each other. So yes, no, prefer not to answer in the first part. So hopefully some of that will address the double counting. And again, we want to make sure that we say Indigenous to Canada, because I think we're kind of starting to see, for example, with the Count Yourself In data, is that our numbers, they seem really high. And so I don't think, I think we're capturing Indigenous people from Bolivia or Indonesia or other parts of the world. And so I think that there's room to work with our data and to actually support accurate numbers for things like Count Yourself In, because it does say that we have about 300 to 400 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis staff, which I'm not really sure if that makes sense. So yeah, we're trying to think about this whole double counting, and then also we've heard from community that they really need to support to make sure that that the services they're providing are actually going to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis persons, because there's some concern that people are using Indigenous to use programs and services that they know and have heard to be good and well delivered. So, hopefully that answers your question, Angus.
I just thought I'd respond also just related to Angus's comment about the Two-Spirit data set. And I think we did use the Our Health Counts framework to build in the Two-Spirit as a branch of the Indigenous to Canada question. And that was specifically done so that we could get a sense related to the Indigenous numbers and the community related to that, and how many of those people identify as Two-Spirit. What has been known from other data collection initiatives related to including it in the gender question as well as the sexual orientation question is that there is some misunderstanding of what Two-Spirit is, and that it should only be solely for Indigenous folks to self-represent. And so there is, but we did include that. So there is going to be some guidelines related to the comparing those data sets related to how many people are identifying as Two-Spirit under sexual orientation and gender identity versus how many have identified as Two-Spirit after being branched from the Indigenous identity question. So those are really great comments to include. And the other piece I just wanted to clarify too is that as part of phase 1 and the pilots, part of the purpose of the pilots is to test out these questions and evaluate what's working, what's not, what are we missing. And so that's also going to be a critical part of phase 1, and that there is room and opportunity to shift and change these questions and answer options moving forward so that we're able to really look at and be inclusive of the communities we're trying to represent.
I think also we know quite clearly that members of the trans community are often not represented properly in circles, and so that's why we want to make it make sense if you're a trans person and you want to identify as Two-Spirit, First Nations Two-Spirit, and then you can later identify as trans later on into the gender or identity questions, and so I think that we know that we need to make sure that persons can identify how they feel, what makes sense for them.
Thank you, Donald. Do we have further questions from the committee for our speakers on this, for our presenters today?
This is Andrea Jeffrey.
Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess my question would be, so who owns the data and who retains it? Is it co-owned? Is it, what happens to the data?
Yeah, I guess all of this work again is to work with divisions, and especially in phase 1. And so really it is city-owned data according to MFIPA and PHIPA. So it is anything we do collect is technically city-owned data.
And I'll just clarify that there is, as part of the Indigenous data governance principles and the framework, there's a recognition of the OCAP principles and ensuring that it's not just being done of Indigenous, Black communities, et cetera, that there is ongoing, not only engagement at the front end, but also when the data is analyzed, how are we going back to these communities to ensure that the conclusions, the inferences that are made are actually representative, and any kinds of recommendations that are coming out of it are also aligned with what these communities want. So we don't want to be doing this of people, but we want to be doing it with people, and that's a critical focus of the strategy.
It's Andrea again. Quick question in terms of that, and I appreciate your explanation, but I think it's really incumbent, because it's about our communities, for us to also have access, and to the information too as well, because as was referenced earlier by, I believe, Donald, Suzanne Burnell is also looking to track. It would be equally important for and beneficial to our agencies to find out where those 70,000 or 80,000 persons are actually residing, and so it's critical for any of the issues that we're dealing with too as well. Again, so it's about sharing of that information.
Miigwech for that, Andrea, and we have also heard that from community that they would like to access these massive pools of data that the city has, and I think community has already had some troubles with our open data platform, and so still in talks, but still thinking that as a part of this project, we would like on the Data for Equity team that's going to be hopefully supported by City Council. We're actually thinking that there will be a 4th position for an Indigenous and data research coordinator. Again, a person that could support this circle, but also support community in accessing city data and connecting people, like connecting them to our data team here in the city, so that again there needs to be like a kind of a back and forth, and so that's why we're still trying to figure this out. Again, we're hoping to get more direction from again you and again this circle, whatever we create.
Andrea, for the last time, it'll be I think you're basing a lot of the information on our health counts, and I would like to think that without without committing her before having that conversation, that it would maybe make sense to have Janet Smiley also part of that process, so that at least it's where our information is parallel, and we can look and maybe at some point expand it to the economic component along with the health component and housing. So, but yeah, thank you.
Hi, this is Millie. May I ask a question?
Go ahead,
I'd
Millie.
like to know if you'll be collecting data from people living in the encampments, Indigenous people living in the encampments.
So I think Social Support and Housing Administration already does the street needs assessment, where they're trying to connect with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in the encampments, and some of their numbers already show that a big majority of the persons in the encampments do identify as Indigenous, and so of course that will continue on, Millie, and I guess that also speaks to maybe some of the work that this circle that we're trying to create could do, because we've heard from researchers that not only the question makes sense, but and how it's asked and how these questions are asked, but sometimes depending on the division, depending on the work, it really makes sense who's asking the question. And so can we partner with an Indigenous organization to have them connect with community and have Indigenous persons be asking Indigenous persons this question? And so we've also heard that, and again, that's some of the things and guidelines and discussions and protocol that I'd like to be developed by this circle and to be led by community.
Thank you, Donald. Okay. I had thought at one point, Ruth, that I saw your hand raised, and I just want to make sure we haven't missed you if you have a point you'd like to add.
Andrea actually pulled down a lot of the amazing questions I wanted to ask. So thank you, Andrea and Yawa. Thank you, Donald, for this work, and your colleague. I also just want to make sure when we're talking about the concept and construct of two-spirit, that it is not just, like I heard you say, we're relating it to sexual orientation as well as gender identity. I just want to, many people know I'm a trans parent. So my eldest came out at 2 and is now 10. I have no idea what their sexual orientation is, but they have been a strong voice in two-spirited spaces since they were for the past 8 years. And I want to make sure that they are able to be counted as a two-spirit, because as I've been told, eagles don't suddenly become eagles when they're an adult. Eagles are born eagles. And so as a child, as a parent who's raising a trans kid or trans kids, I think this really needs to be a space where our teachings are inherent there. Also, I always struggle with the use of Turtle Island. I'm glad to see it's not being used right now, because not all of, now I'm Haudenosaunee, like Andrea. And so of course that's a strong portion of who we are and our teachings and how we understand the world. But it's not, Turtle Island is not used as a descriptor for Inuit community. That's not how they understand this landmass. And I think that it becomes disengaging for communities when it is not portion. I understand the struggle of trying to identify Indigenous from everything else. That's been something that has been constant in my work as well. So we've actually utilized both the legal term of Aboriginal, because that is legally defined, which may be helpful. Also, I just don't want people to forget that there are Indigenous academics and Indigenous researchers in this very group who do this work. So I know that, yes, look out to the other Indigenous places, but you have people who have committed to the City of Toronto to be on your Aboriginal Advisory Committee who are Indigenous researchers, so maybe those people could also be engaged.
Should be glad for that, Ruth, and thank you for pointing that out. And we're happy to, and we're coming to this circle again to get supporters and And yeah, the way the question is structured, so for someone like myself, I can identify as yes, Indigenous to Canada, yes, First Nation, and then prompted to say yes to Spirit. But later I can still identify as gay because I'm gay, and like you said, I was born gay. And I can still identify as a man because I identify as a man. And so later on, so hopefully that will support community and in those questions they can say prefer not to answer. So there is that safe space and that safe option for persons like your 10-year-old child. And so I'm hoping that makes sense. And again, this is all stuff that we want a circle of advisors and community to really talk about and advise upon. Because again, Turtle Island just got thrown out there by some conversations with a researcher and said, but that's based on the population that they have to connect with, which is sports and recreation, which is Turtle Island. And so again, depending on the division, depending on the work, I think that all of this needs to be led, and these conversations need to be led by a group of leaders and advisors. You got for your question, Ruth.
Sorry, I had my mic off. The only thing I want to ask Donald is there any, are there any plans at this point to drill down, to ask open-ended questions about specific nation to help us better understand the breakdown of the urban Indigenous community? I know that a lot of our organizations try to ensure that we have culturally specific resources for Aboriginal folk, and we always look at Native Child, for an example, to get a sense of where our community members are coming from, to make sure that we have access to elders and knowledge keepers and items that are relevant to their particular Aboriginal culture, their particular First Nation. I know that it's a lot of work with over 600 First Nations across Canada, so I'm just wondering if there's been any thought or consideration about that at this time.
Thank you for bringing that up, Jeff. Yeah, that has been advised that later on as we get into the work that we should really be drilling down into treaty member affiliations, or whether you're a part of the Métis Nation of Manitoba, and so we to support work in community. We've been told that that's the road we probably want to go down. But again, we want that work and that planning and those decisions again to be made by a circle of advisors. And we have heard from people like Suzanne that again they need to know also, they would like to have a sense of where community are and their members are.
Thank you, Donald. Okay, then before asking for a motion to receive this item, I'll just ask one final time if there are any more further speakers on this item. Okay, hearing no further speakers, do I have a motion to receive the item? Brian, seconded by Ruth. Miigwech to both of you. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, the motion carries. Thank you. So final thanks to our presenters on that item. Okay, that brings us to our sixth and final item for today, item AA 6.6. On protests and fires. I think before we get into this, I think Francis and I are just going to give a little bit of an overview on this item. I think that we've seen over the last little while, Indigenous community members standing up in the community in really important ways to share their voice around critical issues. And I think that all of us here at the AAC and all of us at task members understand how critical it is to provide spaces for Indigenous community members to do just that, to exercise their voice around self-determination and sovereignty, to share their thoughts and perspectives, to help us all as service providers work with the city to ensure that we are responsive to community needs. We've seen in some of these protests that in certain circumstances, folks can be sharing their voices in ways that are troubling to some community members, and in fact, in some circumstances, have created barriers for community members to access services in and around the sites of these protests. And we've also seen in collaboration with these, or in the context of these protests, sacred fires emerge. Sacred fires are a critical point of ceremony. There's many here in this circle that know far more about this than I do. The limited teachings that I have around this talk about a lot of protocols involved in sacred fires and the involvement of fire keepers. And, you know, part of what makes this so tricky is that we are in an urban landscape where we have many different First Nations folks from many different cultures with many different teachings about what makes a fire sacred. You know, and we've seen in recent months our colleagues at the city, through fire and elsewhere, struggle to comprehend what counts as a sacred fire and what doesn't, and how do they respond to it in a good way. And so I think we wanted to come together as a committee to understand how us, as a network of service providers, can be supportive to community when they are exercising their political right, their inherent right as Indigenous people to share their voice around issues that they find critical and important to them. And to be able to work with the city and fire to ensure that there is always space for sacred fires, but also that to be able to support community members to ensure that those sacred fires are in fact sacred fires, and that those community members have all of the supports that they need, whether it's fire keepers or just to ensure that it's done in a safe way. And so we wanted to start a conversation about this to understand how the AAC, in collaboration with community, can create a space to ensure that both of these things are enabled and supported in a good way in the community. Francis, I don't know if you want to say anything else about that?
No, just that we have been asked a number of times, what constitutes a sacred fire? And you go to 10 people, you get 10 answers. Very difficult. I talked to the fire department in the East End, and they said, we don't know. We need you to tell us what it is. So if they talk to 10 different people, you're going to get 10 different answers. And then when it comes down to it, depending on where the fire is started, people start phoning the police, they start phoning fire department, and they're very, very sensitive, and they're very careful not to want to step on anyone's toes. So then they refer back to perhaps the only Native person they know who is twice removed from their family or whatever. Or they make a call to 311 here at the city, and then they start scattering around trying to find an answer on what constitutes a sacred fire. We've found that too often nothing gets done then. Police are afraid to go in and start deconstructing the fire. The fire department is afraid to, unless it's posing a hazard and a safety issue, they're more inclined to stand back and let it go. And we have not got a panel or a circle of elders who would be available to recommend and offer us these things. So we need to offer our community support. We had an incident in the East End of Toronto where they wanted to start a fire, a sacred fire, and they didn't know how to go about doing it. And so we fast became aware that we should have some protocol in place. We should be able to come to some type of a decision. We should be able to develop a process where if someone passes to the other side, going through the western door, that people would be permitted to light a fire in the appropriate way with a fire keeper, started properly, have it not go for 6 weeks but to have it go the appropriate time, because there were some that earlier this, I guess it was late last year, had a fire going for 6 weeks at a time, kept telling the police it's a sacred fire. So they, not knowing what to do, waited an inordinate amount of time before they took steps. So that's one of the things, certainly with the fires, that concerns each and every one of our organizations.
Thank you. Thank you, Francis. So, this is a critical issue that requires not only us as service providers working together, but as Francis has just said, the involvement of elders and knowledge keepers from the community, and then, of course, direct involvement and consultation with community members that rely on, sacred fires for support. And so I'm very pleased, actually, that we have 3 speakers on this item today to share their thoughts and perspectives. I'm very happy to hear from them. I believe the first speaker that we have is Miss Catherine Gandy. Miss Gandy, if you're with us, could you please begin your 5 minutes on this item?
Hi. I just feel as though that the steps that were taken in terms of the dismantlement of the I wouldn't call it a protest. I would call it a warrior cry, because one of our community members does not have her child at this point, and there's many different ways that Native people can interpret what a sacred fire is. And so with those distinctions, I'm hearing from the chairs that there will be further consultation, which is great to hear. However, as outlined in my letter that I submitted early this morning, I feel as though there needs to be some transparency and accountability measures put in place of how one of our community members was treated, because, and I'll just read it out. Given the grievous state of NCFST and the ongoing impacts listed, the Native community's response this month was to camp outside of the organization for 11 days with a contained sacred fire to address a community member's denial of a culturally appropriate response of an open child protection file. Calls to defund, okay, I'm not going to go into that right now. So there was a number of issues going on there in terms of the lack of transparency and accountability, which then goes to calls to defund and for resignation. And it doesn't have to get to that point. There needs to be discussions in and around child welfare, and this is the state that we're now in. Where
So, Catherine, I'll just remind you that this agenda item is about sacred fires in general,
yes,
and I do need you to stay. Okay, I just need to make sure that you stay on topic. Is all.
It goes part, and it's all relational. I myself have been subjected to different ways of agencies attempting to kibosh me, and that's not right. So it doesn't have to get to the point where there's calls for resignation and calls to defund. It's just the state that our community is at this point when it comes to child welfare. Instead of approaching the situation with respect and adherence of proper title holders, self-determination rights to care, raise, and protect their children, and rights to ceremony, the NCFST executive team contacted Toronto Police Services to be involved, which ultimately led to a Native mother being physically assaulted, charges laid, and improper and violating behavior towards the closing of a sacred.
So we do need to stay on topic. I've just muted. We've had to mute this particular speaker because we do need to stay on the topic of the discussion point.
I'm really offended that you're muting her. We talk about wanting to hear from the community, and Catherine is a community member, and I would like to hear her speak. I'm really offended by your actions, Jeffrey.
Sorry, I'm following the city procedure.
I support.
I'm just following the procedure in which we are supposed to, I'm being told by clerks that we're supposed to stay on topic for each of these items, and that these folks have been allotted a particular amount of time to speak to the particular item at hand.
But as Catherine said, it's interrelated.
I would definitely like to hear from the speaker and hear the entire story.
I don't think we can at this is Francis speaking. I don't think we can at this time. We have to go by protocol, the City Hall protocol. That's what we have to go by. That's why this committee was formed. There are, they certainly can raise their issue at task. They can certainly call a meeting, I'm sure, where they can raise these issues as well. But our protocol for the Aboriginal Affairs Committee for the City of Toronto is such that we remain on topic on the issues that have been brought forward.
This is Andrea Francis Yonko. I want to speak to the issue of sacred fire, and the issue, I think it'll fit into the physical fire, but the sacred fire really actually starts with the womb, right? And I think that's where we need to distinguish where the protection of the womb is that sacred fire. And I'll say that first. And the second component is that I agree, we need to establish, in collaboration with our community, clarifications and procedures of what the secret fire is going to mean. Sometimes some of the nations may have that fire going for quite a length of time. And I go back to Oka, the fire was maintained until the intent was until a resolution, had been resolved. And actually it should still be going because the land issue was never resolved. And so I think it's timely. It's really timely for us to have that discussions and to share with those ideas very clearly, because it doesn't help if we're not clear on them, then it brings in the police and the firemen, and that shouldn't happen. So I'm agreeing that we need to look at to see the different processes that are in place of how the fire should be established. One may want to have their voices heard, and I'll use the February 14th as an example, but they may want to hold that fire somewhere separately. I mean, that's at a site that we can identify the various Indigenous placemaking that people refer to. But I think it's really important. Council Fire holds our fire right within our back. We don't ask for, we go ahead because it's generally intended to have that fire, give thanks. And if there is someone that we do, or the community that is hurting, we also make sure that we do those fires for that. But it is timely, I think, and it's a really good teaching. The teaching with that sacred fire that's within the womb and that protection, but the external fire, which is male, and how we look at that. So just wanted to offer those comments.
Thank you, Andrea.
Okay, so I do see that Angus has his hand up, and I know that we have lots of commentary here from members of the committee, but we did have two other members of the public that were registered, and as a matter of order, we do need to allow them to share their voices first. I just want to ask if Tiffany Malley is with us, because if so,
Yes, I am.
We would like to invite you to speak on this item for 5 minutes, please.
Hello, Ani, bonjour. My name is Tiffany. I am Indigenous, First Nations, Ojibwe female. I reside currently here in Toronto, and it's important for me to have this opportunity to speak because I am not only a community member, but I've also worked in the Toronto community agencies for approximately 18 years. I have a history of providing superb, excellent customer service, support, advocacy to a lot of our First Nations people who haven't had a voice. Specific to this Sacred Fire motion, I would like to speak to, it's very important that we can identify what a sacred fire means. I can agree and relate that here in Toronto, there are many nations that are here, including not only mine, but that also encompass a lot more. And so it's important that we are able to create a dialogue to encompass more voices to be shared, more voices to be heard on what we identify as a sacred fire. Now, I can use my history from my experience in Guelph, Ontario, and how there was a proposal for a making of a sacred fire in a public park. Now, without a lot of consultation within the Indigenous community, this created a lot of conflict. There's actually, there's an article about it specific to the Guelph Sacred Fire, which I would encourage the committee and others to look at. But it just goes to show how one specific action can affect a lot more of the community, and it takes a ripple effect. Specific to the Sacred Fire motion agenda item, I can say as a community member that I wasn't aware that this motion was going to be placed today. Not only that, a lot of our community members were also not informed about not only just this motion or this agenda item, but how they can participate more in these type of discussions. And I feel as a community member, although I don't have letters beside my name, I do have significant input that I would like to share and be part of the discussions that include what a sacred fire is. Now, specifically to the incident that came from the Sacred Fire agenda item, I can't speak on that. But what I can say as a community member, I personally tried to communicate with that individual agency to voice my concerns before it took a turn. And I felt that as a community member, my voices weren't heard, and that if there were processes in place to create a bridge of communication that's unbiased, that's non-judgmental, that comes in a different way, that the response and the outcome, for sure, 100% would have definitely gone different. Now, I have attached also a letter to the committee to be reviewed with some recommendations, because I can recognize that I am only one voice. I do not speak for the entire Indigenous community in Toronto, but I do know that a lot of our voices are not heard and want that opportunity, and to ensure not only just the clients who are accessing the agencies that are on the committee, but the other population of Indigenous community members who live in Toronto who do not access any Indigenous services for whatever reason. We know that there's a large population that does not access Indigenous services. And also, based on this agenda item, it would only make sense that the consultation process must include a lot of Indigenous agencies that haven't been spoken of in the committee, that maybe haven't been reached out to, or maybe the community isn't aware of the other people that also hold a lot of knowledge. And on that topic, I would like to state that in order for us to truly identify what an elder or a knowledge keeper is, this is also a very complex issue. I can recall a report written by Art Solomon for the Native Center approximately 15 years ago. It was a 60-page article detailing what an elder is. Specifically, that was the thesis of that. And I know that from an Indigenous perspective, from an Ashkabewas perspective, from a person who also attends a lot of ceremonies, I can feel confident in saying that we don't have a clue what an elder is in true spirit, other than what we can kind of identify. And I also would like to say that the people that are holding these positions of authority in the committee, you know, they might have an expertise in some type of area, but that does not qualify them as the voice for our people. Because I know for me, I have 18 years of working the front lines. I'm the one who's been working in those very dark places that none of our people want to go. I am the one who has been working with our people who are on the ground and suffering. And for whatever reason, those barriers to access those agencies have been very difficult. And so that's why a lot of our people have passed away, and a lot of our people don't want to engage with Indigenous agencies. And I think that if we were to capture those people in these discussions when we're trying to identify what a sacred fire is, in order for us to not create what's happening in Guelph, because you know what's happening in Guelph with their sacred fire? Their sacred fire is in a public park that's locked up with a lock and key. And I don't feel that there's accessibility to anyone, because in November, when I was living in Guelph, I did have a family member that passed. And I had no access to the sacred fire, because who are the fire keepers? What
Tiffany?
if that fire keeper didn't meet my needs or doesn't follow my specific beliefs?
Tiffany, can I hold you up just for a second? I agree with everything you're saying. Obviously, this topic is a hot topic. Fires, a very hot topic. Elders, a very hot topic. These are things that probably we could go on a 3-day weekend and still not come up with the definitive answer on all of it. I really am in awe of the points you're making are very true. It's exactly, but we're trying to remain, we still have many speakers on this topic, and we're trying to get through it. So I do appreciate all the words that you've spoken, Tiffany. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Was my 5 minutes done?
We let you go for 8.5 actually, because you had so many amazing things to say. I do appreciate.
My apologies.
Yeah. No, I appreciate everything you had. We couldn't cut that off. That was incredibly valuable. What you just shared with us. We do have one more speaker, and I just want to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to share their voice, and then I'm going to ask the committee if they have questions for our speakers today. Tiffany, I just want to thank you for that again, and I do want to ask if Miguel Avila Velarde is with us. Miguel, are you there?
Yes, good morning, Jeffrey. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining us, and please start your 5 minutes.
Okay, my comments today are in reference to item 8A 6.6. All right, so I am a member of the community here in Regent Park, and I feel very offended by the latest actions by the Toronto police towards a woman, an Indigenous women who were peacefully protesting outside the children a society in Toronto and also outside City Hall. My friend was arrested twice for just maintaining a sacred fire. I am outraged. I am offended because I have been part of community building in the city of Toronto. As you know, I have been very active in my activism to ensure that Aboriginal rights are respected at City Hall, in particular the Toronto Police Services. Look, we want that the Toronto Police understands once and for all that sacred fires and encampments are part of our DNA. It's part of our life traditions. We are not going to change for some policy. We are aware that if we conduct a sacred fire, we have water or extinguisher in case something happens. But we haven't seen anything like that. Any human errors or somebody getting burned. So those community concerns that goes to the 311 and they direct the fire chief or the Toronto Police to come and extinguish the sacred fire is offending, very offending to the women and to the men who have been fighting for change. I can't stress out my disappointment. I read Jeffrey and Francis' suggestions to this committee. Look, we have been consulted time and time again. Since 2009, I have attended so many committees at City Hall. We have even identified a task for this committee that is undergoing. And one of them is the continual ongoing education of civic leaders, civic authorities. So look, this is my recommendation. I hope you guys welcome it. Why don't we just have a conversation with the interim Toronto Fire and the Chief of Police, both plus the mayor, because the mayor needs to be aware that these situations are not tolerable. We cannot arrest our women for just simply maintaining a sacred fire. Look, there are so many encampments around the city of Toronto, and it's all the result of Bill 184. People are going to continue to be living on the camps, on the parks, because there's nowhere else to go. We disregarded the calls for housing since 2009. Look, I just want to say that in order to make changes that are profound, we have to tackle this matter today. And I hope members like Councillor Layton and other members of this board will understand once and for all to have the police services respect us, give us the proper respect that we needed. And specifically, I'm talking about the women who we need to have the respect. All right? So thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. And I hope this committee makes the proper motions to be brought up to the Police Services Board so that we have a final conclusion, because this goes on and on and on. I have seen many sacred fires outside the city of Toronto. I have been in blockades. I have been in many protests around the city. Look, all we want is the defunding of the Toronto Police Service, $1.2 billion, and that money should go to our poor, Black, and Indigenous communities. Enough is enough. We need to have this conversation right now, today, and ensure that our women get the proper respect. Thank you, Jeffrey, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
14 seconds under time, Miguel. Nicely done. Thank you. Okay. Appreciate it. I'd now like to give members of the committee opportunities to ask questions of our speakers. And I see Steve, quick at the draw. Mr. Teakins.
So I'd like to thank the previous speakers for their well thought comments. And, the sacred fire to me, I'm just thinking, if I wanted to have a sacred fire, if I had a family member pass away, if a ceremony was taking place, I wouldn't seek permission. I would do it. And I don't think we have the moral authority or the spiritual authority to be chiming in on this. this is not up to this committee to determine who cannot have fires. There are many different teachings within our Indigenous communities and the diversity of them. And, I don't feel comfortable chiming in on determining who shouldn't have a sacred fire. As long as the fire is respected and done in a safe and respectful manner. And there's a firekeeper dedicated to making sure that all those protocols are in place, then I have no issue. I know it's been heated for a number of years and discussed at other tables as well about sacred fires and them being at protests, but these are my feelings on this. And I wish to abstain from any voting on this or anything, because again, I don't have the authority of determining who can and cannot have fires. And again, if I need to have one, I'll do it. I'm not going to ask. I'm not going to call the fire department. I'm not going to call the cops. Maybe I'll tell them, hey, I'm doing this and this is why I'm doing it. So if you get any calls, but I'm not going to be asking permission. So that's the way I personally feel about this. So,
Thank you very much, Steve. Appreciate it.
I'd like to state that I am also in opposition to this motion. I don't even want to abstain. I want to say that I'm opposed to it. I don't want to be involved with any sort of cultural policing. I don't think that's very respectful, and I don't think it's respectful that when a community member has a sacred fire that the police are called and extinguish the sacred fire, as happened that I've seen through videos on Facebook. I think that's very disrespectful, and I vehemently oppose this. And I'm really surprised. It sounds like a colonial agenda item. I'm really surprised that this made it to this committee meeting. I'm actually quite shocked, and I'm dismayed. So
just to be clear, Millie, there's no motion on the floor. We don't actually have a motion on the floor. We're just discussing how we support community members to have sacred fires. Yeah, just to clarify. Councillor Layton?
I'd like to say too that I'm in agreement with this committee. Doesn't have the authority to govern diverse spirituality perspectives of a sacred fire. There are different perspectives, and just as long as it's done in a safe manner, it's really not for us to govern or to police other people's cultural practices. So I too am not in agreement that this committee has any authority or jurisdiction in making those decisions.
I think there's a misunderstanding of what this whole thing is trying to say. What this whole thing is trying to say is because someone starts a fire down at Q Beach, roasts their marshmallows, throws in their chicken bones, and as soon as the police come by to say something to them, they say it's a sacred fire. I'm just trying to stop any interference of people having an actual sacred fire. Like Steve says, a family member passes, it's your right, and you're almost obligated to have a fire for them so that you can send them off in a good way. I'm not saying that shouldn't happen. What I'm saying is that when people set up a fire in a public place and then tell as soon as the police or the fire department comes to put it out, they say, no, you can't touch it, it's a sacred fire. Even though there's all manner of stuff that they're burning in the fire, there's no one tending it, no one started it with any ceremony, and it's just continuing to burn. That's all I'm saying is I just want them to have the authority, or at least know, or at least be able to call someone to get some clarification.
I'm sorry, but that's not what the actual memo says. It says that, Indigenous organizations to address protests and encampments led by Indigenous community members. It's not saying anything about a cookout. So I think our responses are very much in line with what the agenda item on the agenda is. My own thoughts is I think my relationship to creator is my sacred relationship to creator. I've had many knowledge keepers say that if you're told there's only one way to do things and that there's the only one right way, that this is a colonial concept. I also agree with Steve and others that say that we cannot be policing Indigenous spiritual practices. Having a sacred fire for somebody passing is not the only time that we light sacred fires. We light sacred fires for many, many reasons. You know, every month, some people who carry wombs light a fire for themselves to put their prayers out. And those sometimes have to happen on city property. Placemaking and spiritual practices can happen in many different ways in different places. And I think to go from what is on the agenda item, talking about, we're particularly concerned about protests and encampments, to a cookout is a huge difference. If we are talking about what is on the agenda, I think that everyone is staying very close to that.
I'm not sure if we're keeping a speakers list. Are we keeping a speakers list?
Sorry, go ahead, Angus.
So I think that there is a value in having had this discussion. I agree completely that it's not the function of this committee to police cultural practices. I don't think, nor do I frankly think that was the intent. I think that there is a value in taking some actions, whether those actions occur today or whether they come back before us at the next meeting, taking some actions which would promote awareness amongst fire services and amongst police, promote awareness around the concept of sacred fires and the importance of sacred fires. I think that's got a value. I don't see how we're going to move that forward today, but I do hope that perhaps one possibility would be to have staff come back with recommendations, or perhaps we could have an actual. I don't know what can be done today because normally we vote on what's already in front of us, but it might be worth coming back with a recommendation to establish a task force with a limited mandate, a fairly limited, to promote education between fire services and the police department around the concept of sacred fires. I think it's an important discussion we've had today, and I think there's something that can come positive that can come out of this.
Well, and that's the point, Angus. I don't want anybody to think that either Francis or I think that this committee has any role in policing culture. That was not the purpose or intent of this discussion. Really, this was a discussion item about, as I said in the introduction to this item, how we ensure that community members have access to all of the resources and spaces that they need to have sacred fires when they want to have sacred fires, right? And how we, as you have just said, support police and fire services to understand what a sacred fire is, because currently there's a lot of ambivalence about it. Do you have a point, Councillor Layton?
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate I appreciate the conversation going on here because it happens regularly. And before the establishment of the Indigenous Affairs Office, this was a conversation that that staff had internally and probably with many of you over the years, partly because there are individuals within all of these departments that wants to ensure that they're being culturally sensitive and they have a better understanding. Now, much of that would be achieved if our Indigenous cultural competency training was done more broadly, particularly among the fire service and frontline workers, and Toronto Police had had a stronger understanding, or whatever organization we hope will take on much of the community safety goals. And I completely respect what seems to be the will of many on the committee, that we shouldn't be policing the culture and allowing culture to grow and flourish. But also, I think we need to appreciate a point that I think Ruth brought up, that was building on something Francis has said about when do these differences exist between something like a cookout and a sacred fire to someone, because there are those, and I'm sure all of us can appreciate that, there are those that would probably choose to abuse or culturally appropriate something like a sacred fire in order to further their own amusement, perhaps. And I think that there's a very it's very selfish of them to do so, because it puts the whole existence of an appreciation and celebration of these sacred fires at risk. But it is something that happens regularly. I live around the corner from Christie Pits, and there is a fire pit there that was going on unpermitted for many years, not as a sacred fire, but people were abusing the privilege that was there, and they ended up burning much of the furniture that was in the park. And unfortunately, we had to go in and take a more significant role in regulating what was going on there. And all of that, that's all of those comments, is to say that if we don't give some guidance to the city, and I didn't know much about this until a couple minutes ago. I kind of read back through why the city has regulations around open air burning in public spaces. And it's because we have to. And talk about, we don't want to colonialize culture in this way, and it's a colonial construct. It absolutely is. It's in provincial law, in the fire code, that the city is responsible for, the way it's written here, and I'm not an expert on this, so bear with me, is that open air burning shall not take place unless it has been approved. Now, by whom? It's not clear. I suspect as much of this document is the authority required to grant approvals is the municipality, because we are the fire, we are responsible for fire. So I suspect that that's the sort of more legal interpretation of it. There are some exemptions, but none of it speaks to the notion of a sacred fire, nor that it starts, nor does it put any parameters onto that around what could constitute a sacred fire. So while I appreciate that much of the committee don't want to delve into that role, I think the city technically is still responsible for enforcing the fire code, and held to the letter, the fire chief, as the individual responsible for the fire code, would be required to extinguish open air fires that don't have some kind of approval. Now, if we want to undertake some way of giving direction to the fire chief, or by way of city council, maybe it's not. I'm not sure if there's a requirement to come from council, or I doubt council even has the authority, because for things like police, the building code, and I suspect the fire code, it's the ultimate arbitrator on that is the chief official, in this case, the fire chief. So I think we would do well in asking, and maybe this is where staff can help give us some support, is asking staff to report back just on what is the framework for this, maybe even before we start to do some outward consultation, if we choose to go that route, or by way of getting some best practices from other jurisdictions, because it sounds like some other jurisdictions haven't done it well, based on what we heard from one of the speakers, just to give us at least the legal framework for what the city's required to do in this case. Because if we don't give our advice, it may be up to fire chief after fire chief, or inspector after inspector, or police person after police person, to enforce it how they interpret it, and that would be a big problem, I think, from a number of different perspectives. And And ultimately, it probably will result in our Indigenous Affairs Office being asked for their advice, and maybe them reaching out to you all individually, as they've been doing over the past decade. So I think at the very least, it would be nice to see something from the Indigenous Affairs Office in discussions with the fire chief to find out what is the city's responsibility, and do we have a legal requirement to provide approvals for open air burnings, and if not, are they all of them not permitted? Which would be my worry, is by not giving our advice, we're allowing the existing provincial law to remain in place without any interpretation from the Indigenous voices in the city of Toronto. There's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Councillor Layton. I think Selena has a quick point, and then we'll turn it back to Angus.
It's been wonderful to hear all of the comments, especially from community, as well as the committee members, so thank you. Councillor Layton, just to your point around the office engaging with fire and others, as I mentioned in my IO office update, some of those steps are already underway to take action where city has the ability to take action at this point. So the 2 main things right now, although there's lots more work and conversations to be had, are removing the fee that currently exists, and the city has the authority to remove. Council can make that decision to remove that fee for sacred fire, so we'll be going to council to ask for that later this year. And then the other piece is working with the province to change the regulations under the provincial code to actually remove the requirement for permits, period, for sacred fire. So at this stage, in those 2 areas, knowing that there's more that the office is happy to do and work with community to make it happen, those are the 2 things that we have currently underway.
Thank you, Selena. Angus.
So I liked what Councillor Layton was suggesting. I don't know, is it necessary for us to have a motion at this point to reflect what Councillor Layton was suggesting? Or is it something that we can just go ahead and do and have staff report back on? And the chair,
if I may offer some advice, Mr. Chair, just on a point of order, privilege, please, whatever it would be, is perhaps what we could do is not have a motion on this, but it seems like a document is going to come back to this committee that is about the permit fees for sacred fires. That also, though, it sounds like there still would be a requirement for an application. And so maybe as part of the report back, Selena could, or whoever is working on the report in the office, could offer some advice and provide some background as to why do we have to ask the province or city for a fee or for exemption to a fee? Why does sacred fire currently necessitate some kind of approval or permit? What would it take to remove that requirement or to amend the application process for sacred fires in some kind of way? I don't know enough about the act to one way or another say what would be required or what's even possible for the city to do. And again, this stems from the notion that if the fire chief isn't necessarily following just city guidance, they also have to follow the fire. In this case, the fire code. It has a longer name, but I don't know what it is. So it may be that we actually have to change some of our application process to make it easier, or just for our application process to recognize what a sacred fire is. And that is, of course, which was mentioned by many speakers, could be a very difficult discussion. But let's just find out if we need to have it, or else we could be in a place that Miguel, one of the speakers, said that some overzealous bylaw enforcement officer or a fire prevention officer or police officer could extinguish a sacred fire that would be seemingly meeting all of the definitions that we might put on that, rather than what I think Francis brought up, which was when someone uses or appropriates that term to justify what they're doing for another purpose.
So if I may, I think part of what you were describing earlier was also having a report back on the legal framework. That is to say, the limits of power that fire services have, the fire chief has, and I think that's an important piece, right? If it turns out to be the case, as I think may be possible, that cities are required or fire chiefs are required to do certain things, not just because of what the city requires, but also because of what the province requires, then that's an issue. So I think a report back on what the legal limitations are, what can be done and what can't be done, what can be changed, what can't be changed without changing the bigger picture. I think that'd be helpful as well.
Thank you, Angus and Councillor Layton. Okay, so we will have a report back from this on the work the Indigenous Affairs Office is doing to support fire and others around awareness and support of sacred fires in the City of Toronto. I do want to ask if there are any additional speakers on this item. Okay.
Does members, you're referring to, can I speak now? I'm not a
Please,
presenter, but-
please, Andrea, please, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I was just reflecting back on the presentation that was made by Donald and his counterpart. And it almost fits in terms of guiding principles, and it says community first and community-led partnerships and collaboration, ensuring safety and safer spaces. We could potentially look at something in that, because that would be, we talked about engaging our community. No, in terms of Angus's recommendation, that would fit on the other side. That would fit on the legalities would fit on the municipality side, and then we would draw what we feel is important, and then to come together to determine, what's acceptable, what's negotiable. But I don't believe by having this is the law. I think you're going to have some opposition. I think we're talking about negotiations right now. But how can we build on things that are already in place? And it was Donald's presentation along with his colleague that I think it's about reaching out and having conversations with our community members. Now,
Angus?
I just want to say that what the intent was to establish what the law is currently, and then as I said, figure out what needs to be changed in the bigger picture. That is to say, if the laws as they're currently structured don't give enough discretion around issues of sacred fires, then we need to talk about how the laws can be changed.
thank you. And that's what about the negotiation kicks in. And I think I certainly don't want a treaty relationship, because we know treaties really don't numbered or not are not there. So I think it's really important that we do. Yes, thank you for that, Angus. To be really clear what's out there, but what we come to the table to negotiate collectively with our community, and so we're all clear too as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to say that we've Catherine Gandy had not fulfilled her 5 minutes, and she's got 2.5 minutes remaining of her time. It was such a hot topic, everybody wanted to get into it, and Catherine was cut off a little short. So, Catherine, we're going to be sticking to it, but 2.5 minutes. I'm welcoming you back, please.
Hi, thank you. Yes, it is a hot topic, and what I'm hearing is that there is room for discussion, and I just want to cite a May 2nd of this year's article from the netnewsledger.com, and it's in regards to sacred fires. And so the province has already given the directives that, with the understanding that we're in a pandemic, that the province is providing a quote unquote exemption for sacred fires for ceremonial purposes. A sacred fire is an Indigenous traditional wellness approach, quote unquote. So, you know, the province is with the understanding that Indigenous people's rights to access to ceremony is integral during this time. And for the City of Toronto and for one particular agency to respond in the way that they have, I just feel very disheartened about it, as well as with the sentiments of the two other speakers and as well as some of the committee members, that there's to be no cultural policing. And lastly, it's an inherent right. And when the Toronto police are being used as a mechanism to police our community members who are grieving, there has to be some accountability when it comes to that. It's not to be swept under the rug, and there will be further discussions and also submissions to the Executive Committee of the City of Toronto in lieu of this motion. Chimigwech Kuksjam.
Thank you, Catherine.
Okay. We will just, before concluding our meeting today, we'll just ask if there are any final speakers to this item. Okay, so the conclusion of this, I believe, is that the Indigenous Affairs Office will come back to us with some of the information related to their work on this issue. No motions related to this item other than the matter of receiving it. So could we have a motion to receive this item as concluded? Thank you, Tracy. Ruth, did you second that? Thank you, Ruth. Okay. All in favor? Any opposed? Millie, two? Two, Millie and Ruth for the record. Thank you.
Sorry, I was not seconding that motion. I was actually just responding to a child that walked into the room.
Oh.
I would like that revoted, please.
Okay.
I do not want to be
Sure.
labeled as that.
Okay, so we had, thank you for the clarification, Ruth. We had Tracy King move the motion. We do we have a seconder? Councillor Layton, Miigwech. And then Ruth, did you vote in opposition? Okay, we've got you noted there, Miigwech.
Just so I'm clear, the results of this, it's a do nothing, right? It's the motion is on receipt. There's nothing that results from receiving the item.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, I'm really not clear on what the motion is. Can you repeat it, please, so that we can ensure that there's clarity?
There wasn't really any motion. It was just like any other agenda item. At the end of each item, we make a motion to receive that item so that we can move on. It's just a matter of process. There was no action item associated with this. Angus? Angus,
yeah, I mean, if there was a report and the report included like specific recommendations, then we would vote to adopt or not adopt the report. In this case, the motion was just to receive it. We received it. We received it for information. We had a discussion. We received the document for information, and we know that coming back to us is going to be a more detailed report with more information, perhaps some recommendations that we can consider in the future. So that's why I mean, whatever, people can do what they want, but my own view is that there's no harm in voting to receive it.
No, we're simply acknowledging that we had the discussion. That's all we're doing. Yeah.
So essentially, we've heard and received the discussion. That's basically it, right?
That's it. Yep. And as part of that discussion, the Indigenous Affairs Office has agreed to bring back some of the work that they're doing in this, related to this at a later date.
Thank you.
But we're receiving the agenda item as it states that that we propose that like we discuss it. And so even as we receive those that conversation, I think that's what we are voting on, is to receive the agenda item as discussed. And so that's what I'm challenging.
I think we're passing an information. This was brought to us as an information, and we just received it as an information, not on a motion, not on a recommendation, not on anything more than it's a piece of paper, read it, see which is, it's up. If we want to do something with it in the future, we can, or we don't have to. It's just an information.
Is that clear, Ruth? Okay, thank you. Okay, so now that everybody understands it, we are being asked to re-clarify the vote on it. We are simply voting to receive this item. It was moved by Tracy. It was seconded by Councillor Layton. All in approval of receiving the item, please. Okay. Any opposed to receiving the item? Millie is opposed. Okay. Thank you. Miigwech. Okay, I think our final motion is to excuse the absence of members who are not in attendance for today's meeting. Can the clerk's staff please display the motion on the screen? I'll read it for your convenience. That the Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee excuse the absence of Caitlin Adam Lewis, Shadrach Gobert, Marilyn Hugh, Nancy Martin, and Blanche Miyawasi from the August 26th to 2020 Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee.
So moved.
Thank you. Was that Brian? I couldn't see. Who moved that? Okay. And who seconds?
It was Mike, but
thank
Brian
you. Sorry, Mike. Apparently the beards make you guys sound the same. Could I get so moved by Councillor Layton. Could I get a seconder for that? Brian, I get you guys both in there. Okay, Miigwech. All in favor? Any opposed?
For the record, I'd prefer to look like Brian than sound like him. That's just me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor Layton. Okay, so we will now have a closing invocation or prayer by Francis. I'm turning things over to Francis.
Miigwech, thank you, Jeffrey. Jemnado Nokamus Mishamus, Creator, grandfathers and grandmothers, Miigwech, thank you for coming with us and guiding us through this afternoon. It's difficult. There are a lot of things that we've talked about, we've listened to, we've opened our eyes and opened our ears and hopefully opened our hearts to different views, to different thoughts, to different ways of doing things, which is really the reason why we're sitting together in the first place. And there are words from a Mi'kmaq wise person that said, Creator, open our hearts to peace and healing between all people. Creator, open our hearts to provide and protect all children of the earth. Creator, open our hearts to respect for the earth and all the gifts of the earth. And Creator, open our hearts to end exclusion, violence, and fear among all. Creator, we say Miigwech for all the gifts of this day and every day. And I wish you all health, safety, and happiness. Have a good day today. Miigwech.
Thank you, Francis. That concludes our business today. Thank you to members, staff, presenters. Our meeting is now adjourned. Miigwech.